Recording in progress.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Bennett. I'm the current president of Emerson's chapter for the Society of Professional Journalists. So excited to be here with Mike Sager. This event is sponsored by the New England chapter of SPJ. So a little bit about Mike. He's a former Washington Post staff writer, Rolling Stone contributing editor, and a writer at large for GQ. He has been called the beat poet of American journalism, and his articles have even inspired Hollywood feature films, including Boogie Nights and Wonderland. Mike's written more than a dozen books, including the one that we will be discussing tonight, Janet's World, the inside story of Washington Post Pulitzer fabulist Janet Cooke. Mike, so thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Amy. And all y'all.
Thank you so much to everyone who came. So a little bit of background, as most of us probably know, Janet Cooke was a staff writer for the Washington Post. She won a Pulitzer in 1981 for Jimmy's World, which was a profile of an 8-year-old heroin addict. The article alarmed the public and even led police to search for Jimmy. They couldn't find him because he didn't exist. So the whole story was a fabrication, and she ended up resigning from the Post. Her Pulitzer was returned, which is the first and only time that that's ever happened. Legendary editor Ben Bradlee even offered to resign over the incident. This was all coming as Bob Woodward was still in the Post very shortly after the Watergate scandal as well. So, Mike, what made you decide to write this book and revisit the scandal so many years after it happened?
Well, it's really like so many of those good stories. It just kind of landed at my lap. I got a letter from Janet after not seeing her for 15 years or more. She'd, after all this stuff went down, she'd lived in the country for a little while, but then moved to France and lived there for, I think, 15 years. And when she came back, she was basically destitute, and she wanted to write a book about her life. It was interesting back at that time in 80, 81, you know, there wasn't so much media. So even though, say, there would be a crowd of reporters outside of her building, there'd be like, they would very sedately go up to the front desk of the apartment building and hand their card and walk out. And then Janet could like leave out the back door. There was no one covering. It just wasn't, there was no social media. There was no any of that. So she really didn't get much of a chance to, she never spoke or told her side of the story or anything. And so I think coming back to America, needing to make some money and wanting to tell her side of the story, she started working on trying to write a book, and she got a hold of me basically in the same relationship that we always had, which was wanting some editorial help. And it kind of went on for a certain period of time until I just said, I even at one point sent her a nice pen and a journal. I remember, you know, just being encouraging. And I think our relationship was always sort of just started out as I was someone who helped her edit her stories when she was struggling with her, you know, writer's block and stuff. And that's how this started again. And finally I said, you know, why don't I just write this? You know, I was at GQ magazine at the time. You know, I had to come up with 4 stories a year. And this was a pretty big story. And so we just decided that I would write it. And so that's how it came about.
So she came to you with the idea to write a book about herself, not the other way around.
Yeah.
Okay. So how has your approach to writing this book been different than some of the other ones that you've written?
Well, it was different because I don't usually write much in first person. I go out, I find stories that have nothing to do with myself. I might use some of the insides of myself to understand how people live, a 600-pound man, a crack gang, crime stories where you're going out and just sort of like it's an Easter egg hunt and you're finding all the details. But this story was personal. And, you know, I was kind of a young kid when it happened. I was 23 when she wrote that story. I got to the Post, I was 21, and I was a copy boy for a year. And while I was being a copy boy at night, I was like freelancing during the day. And I basically broke a story um, for the Metro desk that got Woodward's attention, and he was in charge. And so I became a reporter at like 22. And it was like this huge thing that I didn't really even get how huge it was. Like, I just was clueless. I really wanted to be a writer. I'd gone to law school, to Georgetown Law School for 3 weeks, and I quit. And I told my parents that they were saving a spot for me in the next year, and they weren't. So I had to make it good. So I ended up as a copy boy at the Post, and eventually got myself hired as a reporter. And that's kind of when my education began. And going through this whole process was a huge education in, it's taught in ethics classes. So you can imagine what it was like to kind of go through all that when I was 23, 24 years old at the Washington Post, and seeing all this stuff go down. And so years later, when I got the chance to write about it, it was kind of like there's a lot of baggage involved in how it made me feel when I went through all this. I mean, I was like a kid, and like this biggest thing in journalism was happening, and I kind of like, as the story goes, I told people I was thinking this story might not be true, but then I was also worried. I was just jealous because I knew this was a Pulitzer winning story. So it's like my friend. Like, I think she lied. I knew she was kind of a liar socially, and that's why we had broken up, but we remained friends because she was like just a really cool, outstanding person. And then all this shit went down, and I was like just in the middle of it. And as it also happened, like I said, I've always been her editor. I've been a lot of people's editor. That's why I run a publishing company now. It's one of the things I do, and I love the craft of writing, and I love playing with words. And so, but so I was sort of like suspected when the story went down, because my name was on the edit trail of the stories at the very early computer system we had. So, going into this story, I wasn't just really in love with Janet. I mean, if you read the story, you'll see that I was gone in Europe to kind of escape her as this was all going down. And then when I came back, she had the kindness to come to my house and warn me that the scenario was playing out at the Post where they thought you might be involved. And so, because I had like a shift the next morning, I remember it was a Sunday. I come back from like 3 weeks off in Europe, my first like trip to Europe as a kid, and this editor just pulls up her chair next to me and starts grilling me. And like, that's just what went down for like and then Woodward grilling me for 2 straight days. The second time, oh, let's have breakfast. And so I get there like 8 in the morning, and he starts back in on me. It's like, Bob Woodward grilling me. I told him everything. I didn't wash my underwear. I mean, anything. I would have confessed anything if I had some. But I just didn't. It wasn't. So, but it's certainly affected the rest of my career. Like, really, like personally and professionally, I fucking hate liars. Sorry, but I fucking hate lying. I like every single story we ever did in the old days had to go through fact checkers, and we had like whole departments of these people that had to like blot out every word of your story and find it correct. And then we had to go through the lawyers and go through them. And like this whole idea of like telling the truth, like this is what happens when you don't tell the truth, you go through Janet Cooke. So it's kind of like I was pissed at her, but I was also had a fondness for her. And once I heard her story, had an understanding. And I always suspected like the story that she told was true. Like, she was just trying to get away from her job as an intern in affirmative action. They had a special 2-year program for, they call them minority hires in those days. And she felt like it was insulting to her. And and the thing was, is she like, you guys spoke to Jason Blair, you guys have talked about this. The thing is like, people like, they get behind, and journalism isn't like a great sport for those who aren't like strong, because they they want so much out of you, and you have to perform, and in order to be good, you have to really be good. And if you're like a broken person or if issues, it's like not a good place for you. And so it was like the entire job was triggering for her. And like, but like, who would know any of that back in 1981? She just seemed to be this cool, calm, collected, beautiful person who had everything going for her. And how would you know that on the inside, everything was kablooey? So, kind of revisiting the territory all those years later, after spending all those years, delving into other humans, and trying to understand things, and learning about facts. It was an interesting exercise. And, I think I told the truth in the story. I said some stuff about her that like you wouldn't want someone to say about you. But we've remained friends, and, have worked together on some succession of movie projects that never went anywhere. But I can still email her, and we're still friends. And I don't know, I think that like the entire thing is a lesson for how you should comport yourself as a human all the way through life. Like, you go through shit, you like figure it out, it's tough on you, you learn something, it changes you, you become a different kind of person because of it. And, for me, having to do interviews for 40 years, I've been a journalist for 40 years. So, this happening to me at a young age was certainly the best education I could have.
So you talked a little bit about some of the racism and sexism that contributed to this all happening. As a white guy, how do you go about writing a book that talks so much about her experience as a Black woman in journalism?
First of all, I'm going to have to complain with my characterization as a white guy, because I'm Jewish, and white people like exterminated like a lot of my people. And
I'm
I don't
also Jewish.
consider myself white. I consider myself other. And I also think that the Jewish experience of discrimination goes back pretty far. And I feel like I have agency to discuss what it's like to feel less than because of your race, heritage, looks, religion, and all that stuff. That being said, I get it that like people in this day and age are like sensitive about appropriation of other stories. Janet came to me to tell this story, and felt as though I was down enough with like the ideas of what everything did, considering especially, I've been a lifelong anthropologist, living with crack gang, writing about Rodney King, the first story about, in-depth story about like that. I'm the first person who wrote the words "driving while Black" in print in a mainstream magazine. So, I was the first person to write about rap for Rolling Stone. The second, Alan Light wrote the first story, and I wrote a big thing about Ice Cube. And it was just going through fact checking recently as it's being republished, and looking through all of the things that we take for granted now that in 1990 Ice Cube was just like talking about. So, that's my answer. I mean, when Neotext wanted to represent some of my stories, and that's why it has a really great cover and all that stuff, I wanted to like throw it out there in during February, but I was advised that that ain't cool, and so I'm like, cool, what ain't cool. But I do know that I have the agency to speak to this story, And I also was literally given the contract by the person whose story it was, feeling that I would tell her story best. So that's kind of my answer to that one.
Why do you think she let you above anyone else interview her?
Well, I feel like, she's not the only person who thinks that like what I'm good at is empathizing with people. But she felt as though I knew her and I understood the story and I was there, and that I would portray it in a way that, like all the stories I've done over 40 years, like they're all fucking good. And so this one was going to be good too. It's like you can't do this job without, it's like the NBA. You want to be like a writer like this. It's like you got to fight your way through all of the minor leagues and get up there and do it. And then every time you do something, you can't mess up. You can't like, Jason Blair is no more. Stephen Glass is no more. These people are no more. There's no halfway route to this, all this stuff. It's why just like ask the extra question, like spend the extra time. Like you can't be like lazy. You got to be like, because somebody will find a problem with it. So you kind of got to be better than that. And it's a way, the same lesson that they were telling Janet, like, you got to be better than everybody else because you're just a darn freelance writer. And I often have joked, in fact, my mother used to say, because she came from the South and in the small town where they were the only Jews, and she used to tell me, don't give them any reason to hate you, more reason to hate you than they already have, as a way to guide my being around other people. And I think as a freelance writer, I think it's the same. I think you just have to be impeccable in what you try to do, and that's the only defense for anything.
Yeah, and Jimmy's World came as the conversation about ethics and journalism was changing, and it certainly really propelled that conversation as well. In the book, you talk about some of the issues in the newsroom, including the use of unnamed sources. So what were some of the areas where the Post was lacking? And can you talk a little bit about how this story kind of pushed forward the conversation of ethics and journalism?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that nobody ever really talks about, but is the most really societally affecting, is the resume. Like back in the day, people could put anything on their resume. And like to find out if somebody graduated somewhere took a lot of effort. You had to call someone had to go to the file, look it up in paper, so the whole idea of the resume scam and like the ethics of what you can put on your resume and who's afraid to lie on their own resume, that's like a huge thing. Like, they can look you up now. So that was a big, change. I think that in many ways, the situation in journalism, and journalism was an early adopter of trying to level the playing field, make everybody like have equal access to like working there and being part of things, and tapping like different people for different like what they can bring to the paper from their different cultures. I mean, Don Graham early on was very much into that in the late 70s even. The problem has always been, it's kind of like, and my dad had to wait an extra year to go to medical school because there's a quota for how many Jews could get into UVA med school. So now there's like this whole reverse thing going on where you have these people being chosen. And then so it's sort of like, and then they're putting them into this program, which people thought was a good idea. So it's like, there's always these good intentions, that don't quite right. And I think we're still working out the process of how do you help people along without like making it seem like you're giving them an even hand because everybody's out there. And even like, part of the problem with, working with diversity today is that it alienates a lot of people who feel like at the cost of diversity, their stuff's getting messed up. I mean, it's like part of like, if you look at the continent, at the divide in our politics today, there's a lot of that is involved in it. You're helping them, why aren't you helping me? So it's like really hard to figure all this stuff out. I think for journalism, it's especially hard because as newsrooms seek to diversify, what they're not doing is, and they're looking for the excellent people, what they're not doing is like raising the amount of money they pay. So like, you have to be really smart to be a journalist. I don't think, it's sort of like not this interchangeable with certain jobs, but it's certainly like that MBA, that lawyer, that doctor, that professional degree that could be recruited into a different profession for a lot more money. It's like, it's harder to find people who want to go into journalism and make, bad money and do this for the love of it. So, that's also part of the discussion when you get to diversity in the newsroom. It's kind of like, it's hard to get people to go in a newsroom who can't kind of afford to be there. And I think if you look at the history of writing, there's a great number of people who kind of can afford, like their family doesn't need them to go make all this money as a lawyer because their family has enough money to live on, so they can go be an idealistic journalist and only make X number of dollars. So, I think all of this is evolving since the 60s. I mean, we're still in an evolutionary process that began, back in the, in the 50s, you couldn't be gay, you couldn't be diverse. It was all like this one system, like in the late 50s. Then starting in the 60s, there's like multiple things that are still kind of happening. And as a journalist, I was first a history major. And sort of, you don't look at stuff, you look at stuff in like 50 to 100 year swaths. So I think that's what we're seeing. And we're still like trying to work out the best ways of doing things.
So do you think that today newsrooms should be making an effort to have some of these programs that focus more on hiring people of color?
Hell yeah, and I think they should raise what they pay. But like one of the problems is the newspapers have been dying over the last year. I mean, since like 2008 to 10, there's been a whole readjustment. But now we're seeing again, like, places are learning how to afford. There was sort of like a culling of newspapers, but then some survived, and then others are learning that same way to survive. And those places, see, what happened was, like, I was like at Esquire, like for 35 years, I had a contract for magazine writing. And then all of a sudden they're like, okay, you don't get any more money, and we're paying you like a quarter as much. And we all said, okay, we just still want to write, so that's kind of a problem too. It's kind of like, as journalism begins to come back, maybe like institutions like SPJ become more important because they need to do for journalists what Amazon employees and Starbucks employees are doing for them. That, it's really, I think journalist should be a higher paid profession because, it really takes a lot of skill and combination of things to be a good journalist. Like, you're a good candidate for a lot of other things. It's just like, you don't want to be bored to death for the rest of your life, doing other stuff, but you could easily, I could have been a great lawyer. I know I would have been a great asshole, believe me, but like, I use my powers for good. And, hopefully you get rewarded for it in the long run. And that's going to be my recommendation to people too. It's just like, you didn't get into this for the money, so just do it for the love. And love means like working as hard as you can, or don't bother. You know what I mean?
So this all happened as there was a attempt to increase diversity in the Post newsroom. In 1972, the Post Metro 7 actually filed a complaint with the US EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and alleged that the paper was discriminating against Black reporters. How did the Janet Cooke scandal impact these efforts to increase diversity in the newsroom?
Well, if you look at that, the Janet thing was 1981. And that was 1972. And then some of those reporters were still there when I got there in 78. So what happened was they instituted this whole program that allowed people like Janet, or reached out to find people like Janet to be in this program. But there's other people that went through that program. Juan Williams, well known in journalism. Eugene Robinson, well known in journalism. Michelle Martin, who I listened to all the time on NPR. She was like an intern when I was like a fledgling reporter. I knew her really well. There's like a ton of people who kind of came through that system and did well. But they also felt as though there was this definite culture of kind of like the alternative people at the Post tended to hang together. And so there was this definite feeling of, we didn't have a word for it then, but there was a lot of code switching going on. And so that was kind of like the difference. It was like people back then, as I said, were muddling, like, so 72, these people are complaining. So then they put something in order, but what they put in there is flawed, but it's something. And then so it continues to evolve, like what we try to do to make these things right. And there's certainly, it's better than it was. That I mean, the 80s were so long ago. Like when you like look back at stuff like that, I usually vow that I never even mention the 80s to anyone who's a student. It's just too long ago. So things have changed a lot, even as they haven't, and even as they have.
Right. So we talked a little bit about, and your book focuses a lot about how, yes, Janet did fabricate this story, but there were all these circumstances coming into what the culture was like at the Post at the time. The Watergate scandal was not too far before this. Was there some sort of pressure to break the next big story, or anything that might have impacted that culture at the Post that would make them more susceptible to an incident like this?
Hell yeah. I mean, that was a big thing at that time. Okay, so Watergate was like 72,
Mhm.
and I got there like 78. And who's the boss of the Metro section being groomed perhaps to be the head of the paper? Bob Woodward.
Mm.
And so we were assigned beats, but what you would do is also enterprise stories. And that was what was important, because if you got your enterprise story, like, which was a story, you went out and found yourself some big ass story that was going to be several parts and like win awards, and everybody was looking for award-winning stories. Plus, if you had one of those stories, they took you off your beat and you could just work on your story. It was like great. But everybody was shooting for the moon, like everybody. And that was one of the immediate thereafters of the Janet Cooke thing, is we were all assigned older journalists from the newsroom to like have lunches with us and counsel us crazy kids who were all shooting for the moon. And we were also like sent back to bureaus. I was living in like DC. Every morning I had to like drive against the traffic out to suburban Virginia to be in the Virginia bureau, because that's ostensibly where I had been headquartered. So there was a lot of it was like the Janet Cooke thing was like, when I was in high school, I may or may not have been a stoner. And there was always these people who are very like furtive, and my thing was like, just act like you're doing nothing wrong. Like the most obvious is the least obvious. And so this thing with Janet, like, we would do stories and like people would check your quotes.
Mm.
or they check your numbers. But nobody ever thought that anyone would like make up an entire story. It was like just too obvious, to be obvious that
Right.
somebody could do that. And but so it definitely had an effect on what we were doing. I mean, it hastened kind of like within about, what was that, 81. By 84, I was like leaving, late 83, because I was like covering, I remember like the last story I did for the Post was like covering this cat show or something, this local cat show. And I'm like, this is where I started out. Like, so I'm going in the wrong direction here. So it definitely had an effect, and people were chastened, and people started checking resumes, and people started caring more about fact checking. But also, in the ensuing years, people like Stephen Glass could do what he did, and people like Jason Blair could do what they did, because it's like, it's too outrageous to even like believe that somebody would fucking do that.
Hmm. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't even think that there was no addict, you know. Um, and even from my point of view, like the juice of this thing is that, like, I was in her apartment when she had this conversation with somebody, like, oh, there's a kid. Why can't I see the kid? I mean, I actually heard that conversation. And I want to tell you something. There's like a lot of ethical lessons coming out of this story, but for a journalist, there's one huge, huge, huge practical lesson. And that is, we all know that we are pressured by our editors to like get more, do better, find more people dead, get the higher thing. The more dead, the higher on the front page you're going to be. But like, do not tell your editor you have this thing like to write about until you get it nailed down. Like, that was Janet's mistake.
Mm.
She could have ended up writing a story that she intended to write, because there was some good elements. Like, the story she intended to write was about how they were letting in this pure heroin because they were afraid there was going to be riots that summer. And so they wanted the people to be fucked up. And that was like a great story. But then she came upon this Jimmy, and then her editor said, that's the story we have to have. And she had to run back to her editor because she wanted that attention. So, and I know that we're all in journalism because we all saw our byline the first time. That's the least common denominator of all of us. All of us think we're special. All of us want to have something to say. All of us like think it's worthwhile that we should be allowed to say. But just like, don't tell your boss you have a story until you have the damn story.
Mm.
Because that's what this created. This didn't have to happen.
Right.
But so that's why I think that, yes, like examining sort of the socio-psychological like underpinnings of this whole thing is just as important, because it's a look at what kind of person should be doing our job anyway.
Mm.
And a lot of those things that like people don't talk about, like people don't talk about reporters and PTSD, like, and what like we go through, like in so many, especially when we're young. Sorry, my computer's freaking out. So yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead. Next question. I don't know if
Um,
I answered you.
no, that was very helpful. I want to talk, well, so the investigation, after things kind of started to fall apart, Ombudsman Bill Green kind of started leading the investigation. It was very exhaustive. In recent years, a lot of newspapers, including the Post and the Times, have eliminated their ombudsman positions. Do you think that this is a mistake? Could a newspaper conduct an investigation today like the Post did after Jimmy's World?
I think, and I've never even had this thought before, but just as you said it, it's sort of like email replaced the ombudsman. Because, that's what their job was. Like, you wrote a letter to them when you had a complaint.
Mm-hmm.
And half their complaints ended up being circulation, because I knew some of those people. And then, so I think I think a newspaper can appoint a blue ribbon commission without an ombudsman, and So yeah, I mean, the ombudsman's supposed to be like neutral, but who's paying them? It's like a position at the newspaper, you know.
Right.
So um, I don't. I think there should be somebody who's sorting through all the emails that come in and that kind of thing.
Mm.
And I'm sure, like to some extent, there is a marketing department and that kind of stuff. But and you know, there's the editorial department where people, and I think like a way wider range of people, like my dear friend Fred Hyatt, who unbelievably has died recently, the editorial page of the Washington Post. I mean, he was there when I was there 40 years ago. The guy looked like he had never aged. It was unbelievable. But he was really credited for bringing so many different voices to the Post editorial and op-ed pages. And I think that's the one thing that the internet makes great. It's funny, my very first job at the Washington Post, I worked in the wire room, which is what we had instead of the internet back then. There were like all these teletype machines. And there's like AP, UPI, Reuters, you know, regional wires. They're all like banging. It was like it was deafening in there. And I had like a 16-inch ruler, and my job was like to tear paper off these things. But I don't know. I can like hardly write a sentence without Googling 3 times to find out things like, what does that word really mean? Or, you know,
Right.
so I think we have like all the tools to do incredible things right now, especially like in the multimedias to do it. I think what we lose is the sense of having some sort of certification
Mm.
that you should be allowed to have the voice of authority. You know, that's kind of the thing that has changed. Like
Right.
starting with MySpace and then going forward to social media, like you could just publish yourself. And I have a whole publishing company now that it used to be the big 6 in New York, and that was it. You know, so it's had it's very good, but it's also difficult because we have to wade through all the false news, all the fake news, and just the very idea that like there's a kind of seemingly logical argument going on in public space about like things that are absolutely made up.
Mhm.
Like it just blows my mind, but
Mm.
you're good with your bad, I guess.
So you talked a little bit about you and Janet's relationship. How did you two meet? What was she like at the time? How could you kind of talk a little bit about that background? That would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, she was much taller and prettier than me, and I was like nobody. I arrived as a copy boy and worked my way up, and so I definitely was earning my, you know, whatever, my stripes. But she was like Ben Bradley did not talk to me. You know, I mean, he like barely knew who I was, you
Hmm.
know, and stuff like that. And she was like, she kind of was a social figure in the newsroom, and basically my job was to go to the night police, to the police headquarters at night. And then on days when I had a story on deadline, I was allowed to stay in the newsroom from 7 at night till 2 in the morning, and or 3 in the morning. And so basically, I would just like walk around the newsroom, wasting time between my next round of police calls, and Janet would be sitting there typing. And ever since, you know, high school or college, certainly, I wrote people's papers. I just loved writing. I got into journalism because I wanted to be a writer and had nothing to say. I thought journalism was great because it gave me something to write about. And but I was like a undergraduate creative writing minor. So the techniques of writing were just, I just always loved to type and edit and retype and just play with words. And so that was my talent. I had a facility, a verbal facility, who, I don't know if my mom or mother is listening, but I will say that I had to answer her 20,000 questions whenever I wanted to do anything. And I think that gave me an incredible verbal muscle, which later we would recognize as saying, she would say to me, "You can't shit a shitter." And I have since said that to her in return. So I forgot what the question was. I'm sorry. Oh, how I met Janet. So anyway, Janet was one of those writers who had trouble writing. And she would be at her computer late at night, like with her bottle of Maalox. And I just basically said, "Oh, let me take a try at it." And I would like sit in her chair and how about this? And I'd edit it. And that's basically how our relationship started. I was like helping her edit because she was like this much taller than me and really pretty. And, I didn't really think I was and I was like younger than she. And I didn't really think I was in her romantic league. But, one thing, it was the early 80s, which were certainly a different social time. And while office romances were supposed to be kept on the QT, they weren't really discouraged. I mean, we were like the Metro kids. We never left the building. And then we just went and had drinks together or went to an editor's house together. We were just friends. So basically our relationship just developed as any friendship would. And, I found her to be sort of like, it was like a Nora Ephron movie when you were with her. She was just so witty and evil and funny, and our conversations were just great. And like, how could you not like that?
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of like what developed. And then also over time, though, I realized she was like lying about everything. And I have a few examples in the book, which I don't need to go into now. But then it's like, how do you, then you find, it was like, in those days, people didn't tell you they had issues. Nobody knew how to deal with people with issues. I was like 23, there's all these adults. And so I just did the best that I knew how to do to deal with a person who had issues. And then we also had that, and I was also 23 in that sense where, everyone knows about, you get into these things where you break up, but you still have like friends with benefits. And then that's that whole sort of just thing, none of which has anything to do with newspapers. It just has to do with like growing up.
Yeah.
And I often have said that going to the Post was like a grad school and a first marriage, all kind of wrapped into one. I mean, I certainly came out of the other end of that sausage grinder a lot differently. I mean, I think that what I'll say about Janet is that I think what I've learned over the years is just to best comport yourself as a decent human being. And that includes like, if you have like a relationship with someone, you should be able to like bump into them, or they should be able to call you, or, not like you're going to be friends.
Yeah.
I definitely believe in the Harry met Sally theory of friendship, but that 15 years later, she could get in touch with me. And of course I was happy to hear from her or anyone else for that matter. So, I think a lot of my career in writing has also been like, I'm not like the best computer journalist. I like call people I've met 20 years ago and I ask them, do you know any of these kind of people? And they like, it's sort of, so it's like how you act along the way. And early as a young journalist, when I had kind of a more evil eye, my descriptive powers were more governed by my eye than my heart. I started to get this idea at age 22 or something that like, yeah, I was like writing these great turns of phrase, but everyone hated me. So, being able to learn how to kind of like characterize and describe and be kind and yet also truthful. It's like what I learned about it from Janet is there's a higher truth even than what they teach you in ethics class. Like those are nothing compared to human ethics.
Right.
And so, human ethics will always guide your journalism if you're true to those things. Sometimes we have to learn about them and, update though.
Yeah, we learned about this in my ethics class. That's where I first heard about it. You mentioned a couple of movie deals that kind of fell through. It's been reported that Netflix is gonna feather a movie on Janet Cooke. Have you been contacted? Do you know how Janet feels about this? Do you think it's gonna
I'm imitating
happen?
Harry Carey. No,
Mhm.
there's this horrible thing in journalism where um, Ryan Murphy could just do the fucking story without any rights. And even though I'm the only one who's ever interviewed her and he's going to use all that stuff, it just legally, it doesn't matter. I mean, the same thing kind of happened with me in Boogie Nights. You know, and there's another movie, Wonderland. You know, as a journalist, if you're going to do this kind of stuff, you have to have rights. You have to get the person's rights. And
Mm.
I had Janet's rights, and Janet and I are partners, but apparently Netflix did not care because we had a competing project with Janet at the same time. So yeah, it's just like tough tutu. Like that's, you win some, you lose some. And I think I lost count at about 30 at the number of options I've sold in my lifetime. And I think it's like 4 or 5 that have actually been made. And then only like 2 or 3 that I've been, well, I got paid for a lot that never happened.
Mm.
So I don't know. It's just like serendipity. And I think that the reason that I've sold a lot of movies is because I work really hard as a journalist to write good stories. And they don't have imagination and they need good stuff. So so it's kind of like, again, like this karmic thing about treating people well, doing your job well. You know, that's the ethic to follow,
Right. Okay.
the work ethic.
I'd love, before we go into some audience question and
Oh,
answer,
cool. Okay.
yeah, to just talk a little bit about how Janet's doing today. I know you guys are still in touch. SPJ President Rebecca Aguilar also asked in the chat some more stuff about where she is now, how she supports herself, has she changed, any regrets? I can break that up one by one if you prefer.
Yeah, I'm just going to answer them all together.
Okay.
Like, while I think I accidentally know her address, I don't ask her for it. And I don't ask her what's going on. And I only take what she volunteers. And I know pretty much that if you read that story, you understand like how someone like her, if she did this, would be mortified.
Right.
She is just mortified. And she doesn't even want $1 million. Well, she'll, if you start talking about a lot of money, she'll kind of go along with it because I don't think she's like in the best financial straits. But she kind of like people always say, oh, let me let you tell your side of the story, all that. Like usually I do send her the people's requests if they have them, like, cause I get a lot through her. And she just wishes it hadn't happened,
Mm.
I think. And she's just like struggling to make ends meet as like a normal sort of lower middle class person.
Yeah.
And I don't really know much more than that.
Did she change her name at any point?
Um, I'm not aware of what name she might go by, to be
Mm.
honest.
How often do you guys talk?
Well, for like 3 years, we had the project going, so we'd talk every once in a while. And
Mm.
then since like it's all petered out with the Ryan Murphy project, um, I've only emailed her, and it's sort of like thinking of you. You know how you email your friends.
Yeah.
Just kind of thinking of you. I don't want to like be contacting for any purpose other than thoughtfulness.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
that's all I know.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for answering all my questions.
You've
We have
done
about
great, kid.
yeah, we have about 10 minutes left. And I have a couple more things I can ask, but I would like
Oh,
to
shoot. Let me plug my thing in.
Oh yeah, yield my time if I
I
can.
thought
If
I'd do
anyone
that before. I just
in our audience has any questions.
go on.
Lisa.
Hey, Mike, how are you?
Hey, oh, who are you?
Good to see you.
Good to
Hey,
see you,
listen,
Lisa.
how does she, I don't know if you know how recent your contact had been with all this fake news going on now. I mean, does she feel like, oh God, like it's almost like a moot point now. It's, I mean, historically important, but now it's incredible what's happening now. And you know what I mean? Have you guys chatted about that at all? How she
Well,
feels about all
I
that?
mean, she's still like the same. She's a fucking pistol. She's just so great to talk to. I mean, she's, we've always been like-minded in our politics, and so yeah, she's kind of how you'd expect her to be be reacting to all the stuff, just as like a private citizen who's on the liberal side would react. And so yeah, she's as nonplussed as the rest of her. And I think during the Trump administration, she was pretty classic at times, because I think we were dealing, most readily during that time. But yeah, I think, and I think I say this in the story, but I think had social media now been what it was or whatever then, she might have had a slightly different outcome, because she would have been able to go to the media, what I like to call the stations of the media cross, the talk shows, the this, that, the other, the tweeting. She would also have been better able to sort of take hold of her own narrative, as you would say today, which was what kind of that story was intended to do. And I think in the end did, because it did become sort of the only other official version of what was said other than the ombudsman's report.
Okay, thank
Good
you.
to see you.
Good
Thanks
to see
for
you
stopping by.
We have a question in the chat from Brendan O'Reilly. How can editors with small staffs and few resources better detect fabricated quotes and sources?
That's a tough one. It's like, if it's too good to be true. I mean, I feel like there's almost this, like, there's always been like this joke among reporters, like when like 20 people went out into a crowd to get man on the street quotes, like maybe it, like in the old days, maybe it wasn't always like a real person. But we just can't be churning so hard that we don't take a second to think what we're putting up. I think that's just kind of what it comes down to. And, as I've grown more experienced as a writer, like I read copy and I see the information that's missing. And so I think that at some point, hey doggy, I think at some point, like, they have to pay a little more, hopefully, and like don't have such a skeleton staff that an editor can do something more than just like print or whatever you press, publish, to get it in. So that's what I'm going to say about that. It's tough, and I think as a reporter yourself, you have to be aware of it. And I'm kind of always like Janet Cooke turned me into like kind of an OCD about things, when it comes to my, like what I'm writing. Like I even like asked my text chain for this essay if I was writing, if this was accurate what I was writing. My homeboys from Baltimore. So it's just the habit you have to get in, no matter how tired you are.
I always forget you're from Maryland. I'm also from Maryland. Okay, any other questions from our audience? We're in a room full of journalists, so someone's gotta have something.
I've had enough.
Okay. Well, I will ask one more question and then we will wrap up. I am really interested in how the Janet Cooke scandal impacted public opinion and trust around journalism. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. It had already started about that time with like, that was the time that news magazines came in and those TV shows like, they went flack. They were like all those all those tabloid TV shows. And I think they still have some. And I think probably Fox TV is the eventual outcropping of what, and all those kind of TV shows are. It just sensationalized everything. And it also made the press, like first the press was like this Pac-Man. And it started with Bob Woodward, right? And it was the Pac-Man for good. And it was just trying to like find there the Pentagon Papers and Watergate and all the good things and all the people going into journalism because that. But then when Janet came along, it's like Pac-Man turned in on ourselves, and all these alternative, and it kind of corresponded at the same time with the rise of this tabloid TV journalism. So and which then was aided and abetted by the internet. So it's evolved. And I think that just like I said that the civil rights for everyone started, in the late 50s and early 60s, and it's still happening. And I think the media, through all that time, and then especially, during the tens when we were reinventing journalism. And so I think we're still reinventing. And I think as we go through that, the next generation has to learn to be fact-oriented, even though they're multimedia. It's like film and audio needs fact-checking too. Posts just need to be right. And if nothing else, if you study journalism, you should have like a pride of like, hey, I'm a real fucking journalist. And like, so I'm just going to get it right because all these duffers are out there like making us look bad. So I think that's like our call to arms now is to prove that facts do matter. And like the only way you can do that is make sure your facts are factual, and taking that effort and making that, going the extra 25 feet, I like to say.
Right. We have one more question and one more minute. So cool. Did Woodward get the appropriate amount of criticism for the Janet Cooke story? And that question is from Peter Mellon. Yeah,
I mean, I think he did. And I think it's one of those things where, and Ben Bradlee too, and like Janet herself, having gone through it and the feeling you have in yourself that you can't take that thing, like maybe we've all had it. If something really horrible happens, the worst criticism that they can ever get comes from themselves. And it's in infamy. Ben Bradlee could not die without Janet Cooke being mentioned. It was on Bob Woodward's watch. It really harkened the end to Bob Woodward being an executive type person too. Thereafter he went back to, running his little I team and doing his books, and he was never again a leader of people in the newsroom. He was never a Ben Bradlee. And who would want to be? I'd take Bob Woodward's job anyway. And I have to tell you, I love Bob Woodward. I love Elsa Walsh. I don't know if everything Bob Woodward has ever written is true. I can't speak to that, but I believe him because I know that he's just like this guy who believes in truth. And so I'll always defend what he does on loyalty if nothing else. But I do hold myself up to his standards, which was get the extra source, and then his standards of interrogating me for 2 days straight, 1 and 8 in the morning. So yeah, I think he got his due, Peter. It's on his record. Thanks for coming by.
All right. We are out of time. I want to thank everyone so much for coming. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. You can purchase Janet's World anywhere that you can buy books, and it is free for any student. So if that's something you're interested in, or if you work with students, please let them know about that. And again, make sure you're staying involved with Society of Professional Journalists. Really appreciate your time. Mike, again, thank you so much. I'm really excited to